Welcome, everybody. This is our third or fourth salon with Packy McCormick, our good friend, and also the person who coined the great internet game as a kind
Great
of
online game, yeah.
great online game. And Interintellect was one of the great games. And I mean, that was just a fantastic moment. And then Alex Danko also wrote about us and created this kind of Middle Earth type little hand-drawn map and where
I
Interintellect
think
was.
was so
This is
cool.
so funny because we in the community tier, we sometimes do werewolf nights. And then we have a whole story. And the whole story is that there is this little sleepy, snowed in alpine village, Saint Interintellect. And like at night, the werewolves come and attack the villagers. And so we always had this kind of lore and mapping of where Interintellect would be, like a crazy research library, weirdo land in the mountains. So I was very pleased to see that I was not the only person who was kind of mind went there when thinking about this. I mean, Becky, you've become an institution on the internet. Not boring is not boring in any way whatsoever. Become basically one of the most prominent technology outlets out there. I don't know how you do it. I hope that you will share some secrets before the end of this salon. And one thing that I really, really love about your blog, and this is also true about Noah Smith's blog, is that you guys are extremely bullish on optimism.
Yes.
And I mean, you know me, I have a podcast called The Hope Axis. And I feel that it's almost a personal duty, a moral duty to be optimistic, as a way to look after yourself and those you love and the places and communities that you care for. That's not necessarily going to happen if you're really pessimistic, right? I mean, look, tonight, a terrible hurricane will make a landfall over Florida, right? And people are, realistic in the sense that they are at high alert and everybody's preparing, but they are optimistic in the sense that they will try to protect the inhabitants as much as possible, right? That's a very optimistic act to say that
Yeah.
our sandbags and barricades and our evacuation will work out.
Right.
So optimism is not necessarily an always rosy state of being. It's sometimes a very tough act of preparedness, right? I mean, Peter Thiel has famously the definite and indefinite optimist.
Yeah.
I'm definitely a prepared one. The kind of reason and the raison d'etre of why we are coming together today is because of your piece from July the 4th on America's birthday, called The American Millennium. A couple of months ago, we had, or maybe this was last year, I have no sense of time anymore. We do so many salons. We did an event with Sean Patrick Hughes on George Pecker's book on Holbrook called Our Man. And they were talking about the American century, right? The 20th century highs and the glorious days of American diplomacy, which some people might argue with as a
Yep.
general category. And that always felt a little bit of a bummer, right? Like, okay, so it's over. I don't know. I just moved here. I would say it is just beginning. So I was very pleased to see that you think that it's kind of just kicking off. We're just kicking off the American millennium. And I wanted to immediately, summon you to do a salon with us and tell us more about this.
Yes.
What your thinking is about this as an investor, as a writer, as a husband, a father, a friend, how you approach this whole, optimism question from the American angle. You seem to me the American optimist. I hope that if we give this to AI, you somehow pop up with your kids. Tell us what made you become an optimist in the first place, Becky McCormick?
Oh, it's a good
What happened?
question.
What's the origin story?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think I don't know. I'm lucky, right? Like I grew up, I'd say like upper middle class, went to good schools. Like things have worked out. Whenever things go badly, like something better comes next, and that's hard work, and that's luck, and that's like all of those things. But I think like one, it's easy to be optimistic when like things have not gone horribly. My family's healthy. Like all of that is good. And so there's like a natural kind of optimism. I think there's probably just like also a little too dumb to be intelligently pessimistic, which is like great. Like a company that we invested in, Nucleus, has these genetic tests, and they like have your where your genes predict that you'll. And I'm like very like I'm like exactly where like the mid curve guy sits on what my genes predict for intelligence, and I actually like legitimately think that's a bit of a blessing, because I can be like mid curve, not overthink things, but then
Mm.
like work my ass off on research to try
And
to
also
like
understand people, right? Because what problem with the people at the very end is they might not have any idea what the average Joe would think about life, right? And that makes it
totally.
right.
My last job at this company, Breather, we designed and operated these kind of beautifully designed meeting and workspaces. And like one of my jobs in that company was like our designers were like, "Oh, we're doing all of these like," and I'm like, I'm like the normal guy. Like I think this is awesome, and I think like nobody in the whole entire world is going to care about that little thing that costs this money. So like that is my job, being kind of like the average guy in the middle. But so I think that's part of it. And then I started, I've been writing, just naturally writing blog. Like when I write about the companies, I choose companies that I'm excited about. And so it comes off more optimistic. I'm naturally optimistic, and that all happens. But in 2022, when things were like particularly like bleak, when the markets had fallen apart and like kind of everybody was depressed, I wrote a piece on optimism, and like have kind of made it more explicit since then. Now we do a weekly dose of optimism and all of that. And then this particular piece came about because it was right after the debate, and the debate was a total train wreck. Like no matter which side you're on, nobody came out looking good. Like the whole internet was kind of like, this is just a disaster. Like America is over. If this is the two best people that we have, like we're in trouble. And then I looked around, and this is not like we were talking about before, that like some of the pieces that resonate most are the most obvious. Like this is not something that nobody said before, but like I think it's kind of beautiful that if like what they're both saying is right, that these are like the two worst candidates in the history of the whole entire world, and America's like still doing pretty damn well. Like that's a really, really good thing. And so I was trying to get at like kind of what draws that AGM, Antonio Garcia Martinez, has this idea that like a lot of American startups are just based on all the stuff that is broken in America, and like that we just go out and think that we can fix it. But a lot of the optimism comes from kind of seeing that in person, and seeing that every day I get to talk to founders who are building housing and energy and like all these things that we think are these really big problems. And like I get to, I guess, because of this job, look a little bit into the future and assume that even 5% of them succeed. And like a lot of the things that we're complaining about have solutions on the way that make sense and just need to be built. And so that's kind of where that piece came from.
There's a quote in your article that I love, and I would love for you to say more about it. It would be incredible to have deeply competent leaders, but in America, people can just choose to solve problems that the government can't, doesn't, or won't. Say more.
I mean, like I'm definitely guilty of this, of just being like, I want the perfect, and like I won't even say who the perfect candidate is. Like maybe, I don't know. I like wrote a whole piece on Josh Shapiro's effort rebuilding I-95. So like some of that at Spa, going out and just being like, all right, the rules are off. The thing that I thought was like absolutely beautiful about that one was that like he was kind of leaning to the right when he was like, all right, there's no rules. We're just going to rebuild this thing. But then he also brought all the unions in and was kind of just like celebrating everybody. It was just like the perfect down the middle, let's just like break all the rules and get things done kind of moment. So like that kind of leadership at the national level would be awesome. Like that kind of vigor, and just like, let's actually just like throw out the rules that don't make sense, not even just temporarily, but kind of permanently, and go. That's also not super realistic. And so the beautiful thing about it, I mean, I guess the other inspiration for it is like spending time in nuclear. And I wrote about this in the piece, spending so much time talking to founders building a nuclear. Coming from the outside, I'm like, all right, like the NRC is a disaster. Like if the NRC just weren't there, we'd have all the energy that we need, and blah, 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 blah. And every founder to a person that I talk to is like, actually, that's not the biggest problem. Like we just need to go out and build this thing, or we need to like, they, and maybe if you got them really drunk or something, they would complain about the NRC, but like they really don't. And like they really view that as just a problem that needs to get worked around. And so whether it's, the national leader, or whether it's people kind of in these agencies, even I would say the NRC is the agency that most actively works against the people that it regulates, because they have not approved a new reactor that's been built in their whole entire history. Even that agency, all the founders in the space are like, no, 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 we just need, like better, we need to build cheaper products. We need to make them safer. We need to figure out how to build them faster, and we need demand. And since I wrote that piece, like the beautiful thing, and I like can't think of an analogy that describes America better than the fact that over the past couple of weeks, all of the banks have come out in favor of nuclear and said that they're going to help finance nuclear. Microsoft signed an agreement to one get Three Mile Island restarted and then take all the power from that. And it's like exactly what they were saying, which is actually like, well, the NRC was a problem. The bigger problem was that there was like no real demand signal. And as soon as there is a demand signal in capitalism, like utilities are bad buyers. They've been burned by nuclear in the past. They wouldn't push for it. They're risk averse. The projects are too long. It can like, it's only downside for the individuals in a utility. As soon as capitalism was like, oh shit, we actually need nuclear energy, kind of like snapped the fingers and now nuclear is happening. And so that is just a beautiful, beautiful manifestation of the system. The government is also, to their credit, the Biden administration is supporting more nuclear. There was a bipartisan bill, the Advance Act passed, that makes the regulatory process a little bit easier for advanced reactors in particular. So like good things have been happening at the government level, but really like what's been driving it is that capitalism was like, actually, no, we need nuclear now. And now it's kind of just happening.
Can I give a contrary take of from what I've read, which is that
No.
actually the, the fact that these startups don't see the NRC as a huge roadblock actually tells us how far away they are from actually building anything. Because when you're just like pipe dreaming like all this stuff, it's super easy to be like, oh, we're going to do this and do this and do this, and then the NRC is going to approve our plans. But when you get down to what is it, ALARA, or the acronym they use, where basically mandates that nuclear energy must cost at least as much as gas. That is sort of written into the regulations. So I actually take I mean, I'd like to be optimistic, but that's kind of where I see it, is like we're actually just so far away that we don't even know what the problems are.
Yeah, it's interesting because I talked to the founder of Oklo, Jake DeWitt, and they are, if anybody in the whole entire world has a right to complain about the NRC, like they were deep, 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 deep in the approval process in COVID. They like all were trying to figure out during COVID how to get and then like out of nowhere, the NRC blocked their application and they've had to re-go through it. They've also had to pay tens of millions of dollars because the NRC, you have to pay to regulate yourself. And even he was kind of like, there's good people there. And like the system's like kind of tough and there's good people there. We're working around it. We'll figure it out. Would it be better if they just approved them in the first place? Absolutely. But even he was there. Doug at Radiant, kind of same boat where, like they're doing this workaround where they're going up to the dome in Idaho and building their test reactor there. That's just a workaround, right? Like if you can't, the chicken and egg in the advanced reactor space is that you can't actually get the data that you need to get approved because you can't actually test the thing. But now there are actually like a bunch of people either, Allo being regulated by the DOE or, Radiant testing in the dome. Like there are these solutions that add a ton of costs and a ton of complexity and a ton of headache, but are solutions. There's also a couple of startups now, and I don't know if this is for better or worse, because I don't think that light water reactors and PWRs are the best technology that we have available. But there are a few who are figuring out different ways. Blue Energy is one. They're putting them kind of underwater. Deep Fission is another one. They're putting them deep, 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 deep underground and using kind of the same reactor that the NRC knows and has been approved in small form, throwing it underground where there's protection and where like you don't need to build protection against airplanes because an airplane literally cannot possibly crash into this thing and other benefits. And both of those think that they can get competitive even on an LCOE basis, which is kind of stacked against nuclear. It can get competitive with solar, one on the first of a kind, which is insane, and the other kind of on nth of a kind. And so, and both have like engaged pretty heavily with the NRC kind of on their designs ahead of time and or have pretty aggressive timelines. I know other nuclear startups that are going out of the country, and so for better or worse, at least they can get data overseas and bring it back here. So yes, 100%. I think that some of it is like not actually having been in Oklo's shoes and been like getting denied. But each of them are not just saying that, like they each have a plan that at least on paper gets around a lot of the stuff that is getting in the way.
I mean, yeah, I just had trouble sort of getting, how many bits of information are we really getting? Because if the founders didn't believe this, they'd be like, you can't be a founder and be like, oh yeah, the NRC is going to make our business model impossible. Like, so
totally.
They must believe it's true.
Yeah. And on the other side, nobody is more incentivized to get as close to the truth on that as they possibly can than these founders, because there's not going to be a liquidity event for a lot of these. Like, it's going to be tough to sell secondaries in a nuclear startup before you have kind of regulatory clarity. And so it's not even like you can pump and dump your nuclear project before NRC approval. Maybe, I mean, I guess Oklahoma has
Although I
gone
don't, I guess
public. Yeah.
if are they banking on there being some reform in the next 5 years that makes it so that they can do this, which is another form of optimism, I guess. But
that is another form of optimism. I think some of them are. I mean, like there is, I forget if it's part 52 or 53, the one that is going to be more specific regulation that has just gone back and forth, and it's actually made it more complicated for advanced reactors and whatever. But there is regulation working its way through Congress. There are plans to go the legal route and say that actually under a certain size, states should be regulating these, not the NRC. They shouldn't be regulated at the federal level if they're under a certain size and a certain amount of safe. But the rest of these really are kind of saying like, cool, we'll go get our data with the DOE and then we'll bring it back to the NRC, or we'll go overseas and get our data, or we'll go so deep underground with a reactor design that you know of. So I think it's a combination of things will change, and hopefully there's enough staffing at the NRC to actually approve the 50 reactors that want to come online in the next little while. A combination of hoping that it changes and designing around it in case it doesn't. But it's a very good point that I only talk to people whose whole life is banking on the NRC eventually approving something.
Any other notes in the room on this before we go on? Anybody else? Either on sometimes being blissfully ignorant and that enabling us to be more bold and ambitious because we don't know how hard it's going to be. And if enough people are stupid enough, somebody will succeed. I think we've seen that multiple times. But also just notes on nuclear and energy. If anybody has any points on that, jump in.
I guess I would just say that it's interesting. I think most people's mental model, right, is that the government and regulation is outside of the market, right? It's like it's exogenous in like econ jargon, right? But it's just not true, because those are just people making decisions. And so, the market itself goes and has this feedback loop with regulators. And I mean, you could argue that the example that you gave, Packy, about kind of how suddenly Microsoft's interest in the space and this kind of stuff has sort of gone and jolted life into it. So it's that I think part of the optimism is also that the world, including those features of the world, are not fixed. And sort of the founder mindset is all the stuff in the market is not fixed. Also, these institutional things aren't fixed. And so you're willing to make the bet, right?
Yes. I think that is such a good point. Something that I banged my head against the wall. We did this podcast, Age of Miracles, that was all about nuclear last year. One of the things that I was banging my head against the wall were like, people saying that nuclear, and this is like a Noah Smith point, and I love Noah, and he came on our podcast and talked solar, and he's incredibly convincing. But one of his points is like, look, nuclear just hasn't gotten cheaper, and they make them in China, and it hasn't gotten that cheap. The counterpoint to that, and I'll get to my point after this, but the counterpoint to that is that China just takes our designs and then manufactures them, and of course, it's not going to get that much cheaper. But if you combine American kind of speed and ingenuity and these new designs with kind of like Chinese style regulation, then that's where you can like really kind of come down the cost curve. And so that will be interesting to see if people are able to start kind of manufacturing new designs. But the thing that bugged me was people saying like, look, it doesn't really matter that nuclear is regulated like this because it's so expensive anyway that it doesn't matter, when those things are so like unbelievably tied together that you can't separate them. It's like it's this kind of like free market argument on one side, and then like it's almost impossible to build fast, test fast, iterate fast, like do all the things you would need to do to actually bring something down a learning curve because of the regulation. And so I hope that breaks, and it seems like there are people who are even more optimistic now than before that it will. And I think it's awesome, like to Noah's credit, like he was early on saying solar and batteries are going to be a really big thing, and I think he's absolutely right on that. I just think it's both.
Yeah. I want to kind of go back a little bit to something we discussed earlier with regard to imperfect leaders, but the kind of general population being more motivated than perhaps in Europe or in other places in the world to just go and fix things. Right. So, I mean, Europeans often fault America for this. Like, oh, America doesn't have, the kind of social net. and therefore these poor civilians have to come in and fix things, whereby, American libertarians would say that the average person who's fixing the problems in their own community or in their own sector is far more competent and motivated in that particular niche, and often has far more money than the local government. Like, why shouldn't they do it? Like, who loses here? So I would like to ask you a little bit, and then open the question to the audience as well. What would be a realistically good leader in America? You painted this idealistic picture and then said that, this is not a really realistic expectation. Who was a realistically good leader? And if we could kind of create this Frankenstein's monster now and create the realistically perfect leader that America right now needs, who would that be? This is an election year, so it's a good time to actually think about this stuff. We often think about what not to have, right?
Yeah.
So what should we have?
This is going to be maybe a crazy and historically uninformed answer. I would say actually, like, and maybe I don't think this is all the leader's fault, right? Like, I think like the president operates within the system that makes it really hard to do anything. But I would almost say like anybody kind of pre 2012 or so, like with then that's like a terrible answer. I think, I don't know, Josh Shapiro was in terms of somebody who's like done it at the state level in a way that I think is like just really interesting in a lot of ways. But who knows what he does in the White House and what he can get done if he has Congress, if he doesn't. But I think maybe like an even bigger problem is just the regulatory ratchet, or like the legislative ratchet that just like keeps getting harder and harder. Like every year, every 4 years, like more stuff just gets put in place that slows things down, and those things don't get reversed really ever. And so I don't even know who I'm voting for this year, but I do, and maybe this is too tech fanboy, and I don't know if these are the right people to implement it, but the idea of like the, Department of Government Efficiency or whatever, where you just go through and slash things that just like objectively don't make sense. If you had like a philosopher king who actually did that in the right way, I think that's a really, really interesting idea. Every year now I pay a bunch of taxes, and like, it's a bummer to pay taxes when you know that so much of it is going to just complete waste, right? Like, I love the idea of paying taxes. I love the idea of supporting America and all of that. But like, when you know that such a high percentage is just going to pure bullshit, it makes like everything harder. It makes it like civic pride harder. It makes all of that stuff harder when you know that your dollars are going to something inefficient. And that has not historically reversed. Like, government has not historically gotten smaller over time. And so like that would be, I don't know if anybody has like the will and power to like go fight that battle. Like, that would be, I think, one place to start.
I mean, the EU itself is a kind of experiment in impersonal leadership, right? You have these invisible bureaucratic powers in place, and it kind of leads to this institutional nihilism. Eli Dorado was on Interintellect at a salon recently, and he was talking about this whole idea of basically just checking out. And one thing that a good leader can do is just make you engaged, right? Like, make you emotionally kind of invested in what the hell is going to happen, which is kind of insane if you think about the size and scope of America. Like, to have somebody to kind of bring it all together when they have that talent, that's kind of mind-blowing. And also one reason why, big countries have just completely different dynamics, and why Brazil, Russia, I mean, very frequently they have ongoing catastrophic scenarios, because when somebody finally unifies the country under whatever banner, it's hard to think of losing that again. But when it works, it's really good when it works democratically. Anybody here has a note on what a good realistic leadership in America would be in 2024?
This is actually kind of what attracted me to the salon, is because I do think, I think it's true that for 50 years, we have underestimated the virtues of the market and the ability of of American to innovate and improve people's lives. But I also think that politically, like, I don't think it's a question of leadership. I don't think, I mean, look, Bloomberg, say, was mayor of New York City for 8 years. He seems like a very competent person, about as high on that scale as anyone is reasonably going to be. But what difference did he make? Like, he kept things sort of in line for 8 years.
Didn't he ban sodas? You're
Well,
welcome. Josh, you're welcome.
Well, I don't live in New York City, but he didn't fix the MTA. He didn't fix any of the capital, construction costs.
Yep.
It's like it seems like to me like structurally it's a structural problem with democracies, that they all seem to move in this direction, and no one really knows how to move them in the opposite direction.
Yeah, and there needs to be the purge for regulate or something. I think that's like the one thing the founding fathers didn't build in that would have been pretty interesting, is some way to deflate that trend, if they had been able to foresee that, and would have been tough to do, not having had experience with a large democratic republic. But but
isn't that fundamentally like very pessimistic? Because there really is no example to point to and say, here is a large democratic state that's done this.
Yes, universal sunset provision. I don't know, like there's a lot of things that you could say that nobody's ever done this that America's done really well. And so I think like part of the project is figuring out how to fix those things. I obviously do not have the answers on this. Like part of my answer is people just have to go out and build things. Like we kicked this off talking about the storm in Florida. I thought Pirate Wires did a great job today of showing kind of 3 private companies stepping up, SpaceX providing Starlink the cell phone, the company that built the seawalls, and then Amazon setting up disaster relief. Like some of that is just people taking matters into their own hands and companies taking matters into their own hands. Some of I think Texas is so unbelievably interesting as an experiment, and who knows if the country goes the opposite way. Like writing about Base Power Company, it like really solidified this for me, that they have a fairly objectively like kind of unreliable grid right now. They're their own kind of power grid, deregulated market, super messy. I also think that they will end up long-term with a more stable grid than most of the country, because it allows for room for entrepreneurial solutions to come in and help things. And I think there's a lot of experiments like that. I mean, Austin being able to kind of build so much housing that there's like too much housing despite the inflow of people. Like there's a bunch of things that are happening in Texas that maybe the rest of the country at some point looks at and says like, I don't know, that seems pretty good. I think like one of the things that came across in the nuclear podcast and just generally is like popular support, like vocal popular support, really does matter and move the needle. So maybe one of the features of the leader is what Anna was saying, where it's like really rallying people around these things, so that even if the president themselves can't just wave a wand and do things, they can whip up fervor to get people to go out and do things. I think like Trump has a lot of good in his policy. One, who knows if like that's the actual plan. And then 2, he sort of, I said that's maybe like the wrong messenger. But if you had someone a little bit more down the middle saying like, look, a lot of this stuff is broken, we need to fix a lot of this, you guys are awesome, we can go build things, I think that does help whip up some support. So Microsoft coming in on nuclear is important, but so is the fact that like every Pew poll shows more and more and more public support for nuclear, to the point where it's not crazy for Congress people to go out and pass the Advance Act and the Senate to go out and pass the Advance Act. And so I do think there's a little bit of that as well. And so maybe there are, like, I do like the idea of having almost these like little special economic zones in Texas and in Wyoming and wherever else, where they can try experiments and the rest of the country can look at it and say like, that's actually a pretty good, that seems like it's working pretty well.
I mean, that's the whole point of the federal arrangement, right? That these parallel experiments. The EU might be the counterexample to that. I just want to add one point here, because I think it's really important. So when we say Amazon or a private company steps up to provide relief in a disaster area, we forget that it's people, right? So somebody woke up one morning, went to work, and was like, I'm going to go and talk to my manager because I have this idea that please give me $100 million and we will bring this stuff to these people. And in a private company, an individual or a small group can actually achieve this in like 4 days, get the money and go there and do it, which is almost never the case. I mean, we've seen this thing called COVID as the kind of country example here. What happens when governmental organizations are trying to step up quickly and solve problems? And the results are famous. And I think this kind of competition between, a market-minded person would say that governments improve because they are being competed with. And of course, this is true for some governments, and for some it's not good. And for some, it will not change how ossified they are. I'd like to ask you a little bit about optimism in your experience as you see it in yourself, in your family, in your founders, in your colleagues. How does optimism look as a competitive advantage? David Deutsch famously says that fun has an almost kind of existential importance in our lives, because if you're having fun whilst doing what you're doing, you will always outcompete somebody who's as good, has as many resources, everything is the same, but you're having fun, you will win. So tell me, how do optimists outcompete the pessimists?
Yeah, I guess it's the same answer there, right? That if you believe that you can do something, you're going to work harder towards it. Then if you don't believe it, you'll set more ambitious goals. You'll do all of those things. Alex Wang at Scale wrote a great piece on kind of the importance of optimism. One of the things he was saying is like, even in something as practical as setting your company roadmap, if you're optimistic about your timelines, like you set your roadmap such that you get more accomplished in a given amount of time, and then maybe you fall short, whatever, but you're definitely going to do a lot more than if you think that you can get less done, and then you work to that goal. And so I do think there's a little bit of, I'm just make it divisive figure night, but a lot of that in Elon Musk and his companies were like, there are goals that are 7 years too optimistic or more. Like we're supposed to have robotaxis a very long time ago at this point, but driving towards those things and pretending like they're things that can actually happen has created like some pretty unbelievable projects. When you compare SpaceX, for example, to Boeing, right? Like it's night and day. Or even Blue Origin, which is run by one of the most competent people in the history of the world, in Jeff Bezos. Just like that kind of iteration speed, I think, is unbelievably important. I was rereading Ryan Arthur's work on increasing returns and path dependence, and like it really got me thinking about so the path dependence idea essentially is that like a lot of small random early events, and some things that you control, but a lot of small random early events set the path of a technology, and that gets locked in. So like VHS and Betamax are two of the kind of prime examples. Actually, in nuclear, the Navy wanted light water reactors for their submarines, and so light water reactors got locked in. But there is this and I almost wrote about this week and couldn't quite figure it out, so I'm not going to say it well either. But like the sense that I got reading it, that like all those random kind of early events like really should just be like, you can take that into your own hands and make them not random, and apply a ton of pressure and a ton of execution and optimism kind of early in the process to try to create some of that luck that then gets locked in and sets you on a certain path. Like you can even see this at work, right? Like when I was in investment banking, I worked my ass off more than anybody else for the first 6 months. And then the rest of my time there, everyone just kind of thought I was a really hard worker. And so I think like that ends up happening in a lot of things, where if you apply a lot of pressure really early, where there is the most leverage, if you just view it as a timeline, that you can get things accomplished. And I think like kind of being optimistic and like just putting yourself out there, creating that luck, I think actually not just in like a woo-woo way, but like in a real way, can lock in kind of certain companies over others, or certain people over others.
I love this. Any notes here on Zach or anybody else on optimism as competitive advantage and the importance of beliefs, maybe in your personal experience?
I think it's a strategic mistake, or in the sense that it allows you to make bad bet, super high variance bets that are maybe negative EV for you, but positive EV for the world.
Yes.
And so a lot of founders are sort of deluded But then you don't know which ones are diluted until the tie goes out, and then hey, some of them turn out to be miraculously right. Like I think Elon Musk is a good example of someone who's made what seemed to be terrible bets, but somehow won out.
I think yeah, I mean, like that is the beauty of capitalism is like a bunch of people who are delusional about their own ability and success can go out and try crazy things, and then some of them work, and we're all better off because some of those work. Like I think that is a magical.
But there are lots and lots of founders who work incredibly hard and are in fact their optimism is misplaced. But we don't suffer. We get the benefit of the ones who are correct and don't have to worry about the ones who are wrong unless we are them.
Yeah, I almost think there's like too many optimistic maybe like indefinitely optimistic founders at this. Like I wonder what the startup ecosystem would look like if there were less people who are like awesome fourth employees at a company, not starting a company and actually being a fourth employee at a company. I wonder if those companies would actually do better and there'd just be less noise in the market. It's capitalism, can't control that. Great that people are going out and trying different things, but you do see a lot of things that like you can just tell from day one are either like not going to work or like will just be very small and people are going to waste like their prime years doing those things. And so there is definitely a little bit of that over optimism, but I don't know. Like I really do think that following, like if you can identify, and this is the hardest part of this whole job, but like the really, really, really exceptional founders, like kind of like we were talking about nuclear, like have done all of the work to bet these like very valuable, even in economic terms, if they could go get a job somewhere else or start something different, made like a really, really high stakes bet on this particular idea. I think like that is a good way of directing capital or attention or whatever else, if you can figure out what those look like. I also think you made the point earlier about the past 50 years, like we underestimated the market, whatever. I do think like tech has to, and like this is my like optimism kicks into overdrive on this one, because I think even if we like wasted time with cat videos and like way too many versions of the same B2B SaaS product or whatever, like that the past 50 years are the only reason that all the cool shit that's being built now are able to be built. And whether that's like AI being trained on all of those cat videos and all this stuff that we put on the internet, whether that's like all the software being in place to do kind of, whether it's software-defined networking or blimps that can fly themselves because we have AI now, like all of that stuff, like the past 50 years made that possible. But I do think like for tech to say now, like, actually, no, like trust us, we can fix all of the country's problems. You do really have to believe that we're in like a new kind of situation where it's not just like we're making Facebook again over and over and over again for the next 100 years.
I love this.
Actually,
oh, sorry, Ravi, go.
Yeah, I was actually curious about how you view the evolution of techno-optimism over the last 20 or so years, with people being really optimistic about the internet opening all these things, and then it turning out to have these negative effects on our attention spans or surveillance or whatever. So is this new techno-optimism is it founded on new technological developments that we can point to and say that these are the new things we have to be optimistic about, or is it more of a cultural mindset thing, or what's the basis of it?
Yeah, I just read The Master Switch by Tim Wu, which I thought was really good. And it talks about like all of the communication technologies over time and whether the internet's actually a different thing or whether it's like a new version of the same old thing that started with the telegraph and telephone and kind of has gone from there. And one of the interesting things that when you look back at all this is like there's equal optimism about the radio and equal fear about the radio, where it was going to be this thing where all of a sudden all of these people who couldn't communicate in real time could all hear the same thing. And people thought that like education was going to change dramatically with the radio, and like all the same things that people said about the internet, they said about the radio, then they said about TV, all the bad things they said about the internet, maybe not all, but a lot of the bad things they said about the internet, they said about TV, they said about the radio. And so I think like there's something about newness generally where in the beginning you're like, fuck yeah, like this is going to be the one. We are like, actually, I think we figured it out this time. And then the bad stuff comes out and the good stuff comes out. I think the interesting thing about the techno-optimism now to me is that it is about these more kind of physical tangible things. I think like any technology that involves people, which all of the communications technologies are going to get like the good and bad parts of people from them. But some of these other ones are like, I don't know, can your rocket fly? Can your airplane fly at supersonic speeds cost effectively? Yes or no? Or is your energy cheap and clean? Yes or no? And like those things, you'll have to see in the market. SpaceX has done a very good job. Anduril seems to be doing a very good job and just won another contract. So like the early kind of prototypes of this new kind of company are seeming to do well. But it does seem like there's going to be pluses and minuses to almost anything. But it does seem like this is a little bit more binary and less messy, where it's like if you can build this thing that works, it just delivers a thing that people already do, but more expensively, more slowly, more dirtily, whatever. And so the techno optimism now, and the one that I'm so excited about, really does feel like it's around like people actually thinking there's something has changed and we can go rebuild all the stuff that we do already, but better, faster, cheaper.
There's this weird thing about human nature that, and I see it at every scale, even in my own company. Like we work 2 years to solve a specific set of problems, something that keeps going kind of awry, and and then it's fixed, and then we forget we ever had it. And humanity is very similar. There's this joke that AI is whatever is left that humans can't do, right? Or no, AI is something that computers can't do, or something like whenever AI unlocks something, we're like, oh, that's not AI. And I feel similarly with progress. Like, as I tell my team, sometimes you need to sit down and just kind of give yourself a hug and be like, we did it. As humans, we solve these things, and we only need to solve the stuff left to be solved. And the fact that that group is becoming smaller and smaller is really good. Anyway, just to note, but I want to go back to the question of morale, because you're basically arguing that belief will lead to more positive outcomes. I love Tyler Cowen and Danielle Gross have this idea in their book Talent that, and we will talk a little bit about anti-fragility, which you also talk about in your piece. But I think in Tyler's system, and I thought about this a lot, he argues when asked how he can tell if somebody has resilience, right? Because you invest in talent, whether it's emergent ventures grants or fast grants, what Tyler is doing, or an actual equitable investment, what you as an investor are doing. You want to know that this person is not just talented and strong now, but that in their uncertain future that kind of spans through the distance, they will continue to be like that. And it's almost impossible to tell. And so, people develop their own formulae, especially if they have worked with talent for, years and years or decades and decades. And Tyler says that he measures or kind of tries to predict level of resilience by like how big the belief system of this person is. So somebody who has, whose self-belief, identity, drive is based on like one thing, like I'm going to go to an Ivy League school and then my first job is going to be great. And then if the first job is not great, then, this resolution might be a little bit broken. Whereas if somebody has these like seemingly dumb, over-optimistic, unrealistic, giant belief systems, or when a country or a group or a marriage, has that, suddenly, these little failures, little bumps on the road, it's normal, right? Things go badly and then you try again because your actual belief system, its scope hasn't even been, approached, it's just like far away. And so I really believe in beliefs being kind of the key here. And, as you were talking about morale needed for victory, I immediately, because I think about them multiple times an hour, I thought about the Roman Empire. And you actually, you compare America to the Roman Empire in your piece. And, a couple of weeks ago, this Ronald Reagan speech was circulating about how the difference between America and all the other countries. And as a recent American immigrant, I definitely, at least I relocated, we'll see what happens then. I definitely feel this, is that, when you move to France, you are a foreigner in France. And when you move to China, you're a foreigner in China. But when you move to America, you can become an American. And everybody's like, great. And Mary Baird, the historian, says the same thing about Rome, that Rome was the only place in the antiquity where like Packy McCormick and family could move, and like literally you would cross the threshold of the city and now we're Romans. And everybody's like, cool. So I'm just wondering how you're thinking about America being a kind of new Rome, whether that analogy stands in any way for you, or is it just a giant cliche and Tom Holland, not the actor, but the historian, is to blame?
I have friends who are very into Roman history. I am not nearly into Roman history enough to draw the parallels myself.
You didn't name your daughters, three daughters after Roman emperors? I don't know.
Yeah, Zuck is one of the friends that I was
talking
talking
about.
about.
Tech like this, I don't know.
Yeah, no. Yeah, I don't have specific points on whether I think America and Rome are where they're similar and where they're dissimilar. I think the immigration point is a very interesting one. But I don't know. I mean, like the Roman government was like, I was using it as like almost like contrast as opposed to a comparison, just kind of saying like that was still the Roman government in charge, and if you have bad leaders there, you're in trouble. And all the other things, birth rate decline, like all the things that may have led to the decline of the Roman Empire. Whereas here it just does, and you said the next topic was anti-fragility, like it just is more anti-fragile to that. That like I think there's so many people invested in this idea of America, and the resources are so strong here, and we do get waves of immigrant talent and all of that, that like were the government to kind of like crumble, like maybe that's actually even like a good, if it like really crumbled, maybe that's a good thing. I've been reading a bunch of biographies about kind of like second industrial revolution leader, like the robber barons essentially, which are the best. And I think those guys get a bad rap in history and like are mostly good. And then like just become really, really powerful and do things. Vanderbilt, the author, I'm reading the first tycoon now about Vanderbilt. And like really it's a long book. I'm like a third of the way through. Really the big critique is like he did all these things, but then also he like manipulated stocks or something, and like little guys lost money. And like compared to everything that he did, it is just like not even close to a comparison. When he was like I guess maybe 60, like people wanted him and George Law to run, who was another kind of shipping tycoon, to run for president because the Whig Party had totally fallen apart, and like there was all of this upheaval. This was like directly kind of pre the Civil War. And so like even when everything kind of crumbled, these people built America, built the railroads, built the paths from New York to San Francisco. The gold rush happened. Then after that, like all these people came, like kind of, the political stuff is very much in the background of all of these stories and is a part of all of these stories. But in Vanderbilt, like the government was actively giving mail contracts to people who were charging 3 times as much for worse service, and he still beat them. And so like, I do think there is like the point that I was trying to make with Rome is that like the system in America is set up such that even if the government is the absolute worst, we're still all right.
Do you see charter cities as a movement? Esmeralda, Edge Esmeralda, Praxis, as kind of the ultimate American project, and do you invest in any of them?
I personally invested. I haven't done any fund investments in them. I think they're just different. Like I love them, but I think they're just different. I personally invested in one called Prototown, which this guy Joshua Farzad is starting. Essentially a town for hard tech builders, 30 minutes outside of Austin, where you can go blow shit up and put your like small nuclear reactor, like all like
there's like a hospital nearby.
There's not yet, but there should be a hospital nearby. But like has like real companies kind of looking at actually setting up kind of manufacturing facilities down there. They're like kind of
like the scout camp in Moonrise Kingdom, when the kids are just like blowing shit up. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's exactly
under supervision.
It's exactly that. And I think that's also like, and that one happens to be in Texas. Like I love the idea of experimenting with all this stuff.
So it's perfect. Yeah.
I think one of the cool things about space exploration is going to be like we get to try different forms of government on these different like rocks, like 100 years, whatever in the future, when we're like actually colonizing different places, you can try a bunch of different things, kind of like with clean slates, which I think will be super fun. So I don't know.
I mean, it'll be super fun for where it works out. The other ones, it will be, A lot of people
awful.
die.
You'll be
Yeah.
stuck on an asteroid
Sorry, it's a
somewhere with
terrible
like the
joke.
wrong form of
Yes.
government. Yeah. But yeah, I'm all for it. I'm like a big Solano County, whatever fan. I like all of these experiments happening and think that we should figure out how to build more of the
Oh, I
cities.
love this. Any big Roman Empire fans here, and guys, and how do you see this question?
I mean, as much as I do enjoy Roman history, I've often found analogies to be somewhat underspecified because, like, the Roman Republic is a very different thing than the Roman Empire, and so, or Byzantium is a whole nother. So, like, what are you can make it. You're not even clear what you're analogizing exactly, and then of course, the Roman Empire went through a bunch of different phases and disasters and triumphs, and so it's like, well, it's not clear if there's any coherent there to me at least.
Yeah.
I can't comment on Rome much necessarily, but I really like this question of morale. I think that gets to what this tension between techno optimism and a lot of the other currents in the culture right now, because I think the like confidence in science and progress had the wind knocked out of it in the 20th century with maybe the environmental crisis and then the question of inequality nowadays. So I think, yeah, I think a big question for progress is how do we restore that sense of morale? And it's almost like a cultural question rather than a technological question, because I think the tech people are definitely convinced of the techno optimism side, but getting everybody else on board is still a kind of a question, I think.
What do you guys see? Because techno optimism came up a couple of times. Like, give me like a Steelman and Strawman version of techno optimism. Like, what would somebody who really, and I know the answer because I'm European, so I know exactly what they would say. Like, what would somebody who is not buying it say, and what would be the strong argument that you guys would present to them? I'm taking notes.
I'll take a crack at that. I think that there's the steel man, I think, is actually very similar to the point that you make, Packy, about where you have those diagrams of like the directionality of the pull, right? Of like the sort of institutional pulling one. Yeah.
Do you want to give a recap of that if somebody's watching this later on? And
I'll let the author do that.
Okay.
This was like I have used this as a crutch in a few different pieces, and I use it twice in this one, where I just asked Claude for like some very rough thing to kind of like help think through an idea. And this one was progress being a vector sum of the government and entrepreneurship. And if the government is like doing absolutely nothing and entrepreneurship is pulling like at full strength, then you still move up. If the government is pulling exactly in the opposite way and entrepreneurs are pulling this way, then like you're pretty much stuck. And if you're both going backwards, which wouldn't happen on the entrepreneur side, but then you're in real trouble. Or if like the entrepreneurial vigor isn't there and you're pulling back, the government's pulling back really hard, then you're in trouble. And the part of the argument was like that there's kind of throughout history, or even like China today or Europe today or whatever, like the government is stronger than the entrepreneurial force. And so no matter how hard entrepreneurs in a particular society pull, the government can pull harder in the other way. And if they aren't kind of, pro progress, then you're in trouble.
Maybe this is a good moment to talk a little bit about this concept that you're introducing in the piece, American Millennium, which is anti-fragility through entrepreneurship. I think
I want to hear the steelman of.
Oh yeah. Sorry, just okay. Yeah.
Well, I think the steelman it's essentially that if you lean fully into progress on net, you solve more problems than you create, because you do create new problems as you solve old ones. And so there's basically, it's like there's a bias in the nature of technology and science and innovation such that on net you solve more problems than you create as you go along. And of course, the straw man is that no, actually you're just multiplying problems. There are these like massive global things that you create. The risks are huge. The displacements are too big. The job loss or whatever is too great. And therefore you got to lean back away from progress.
And resources are finite.
I think the anti-techno argument, to me, the strongest one is a hedonic argument that basically says, the first 200 years of progress, like, we went from famines to not starving, and we went from 40% of children dying before the age of 5 to basically none. and we solve all these problems that make a difference in human in well-being that is like incontrovertible, that really speaks to people. But in the past 50 years, since 1970, maybe even, like we have this amazing technology, but it's not really clear that like it provides that much hedonic benefit. And to the extent that it does, I think you're on a treadmill. We're like, okay, I'm watching 4K TV now. I installed a 4K projector, and I'm like, wow, this is amazing. But like, yeah, I grew up watching 27-inch Trinitron, and like, whatever. The Flintstones seemed pretty good back then. I don't know that it was a big difference. And so, the costs that you maybe that Facebook or the social kids, things now have, whether you think Che is right or not, there's costs to these things. But the problem is there's just not a lot of hedonic benefit left. Like there's just no way to make people better. At least not, maybe lifespan. Maybe there's health things that there's still a new frontier there, but just like more stuff doesn't seem to be benefiting us.
But interestingly, the European kind of the small person argument that I hear a lot for degrowth and kind of against any kind of techno-utopian sentiment is hedonistic, is saying that, we are sitting in our little community garden somewhere in the Netherlands, on the beach in Italy, on this terrace in, Spain, having sangrias, and techno optimism is trying to take this away from us and put like VR glasses on our eyes and lock us into our homes. So it's a little bit more complex, I think. It is, I mean, my entire, Hope Axis project has been, there for kind of counter the public nostalgia arguments. But if you go to, I don't know, Portofino in Italy or the Lake Como or whatever, I mean, I'm there and I'm like, yeah, this is exactly how I would want to live after I died. Like this is heaven. It's great. But like, you're not getting anything done. And it's just like, but it's a hedonistic argument. And I think a lot of people, whenever somebody is like, keep the factory open that is not producing anything worthwhile because I've worked here for a long time and my house is nearby, that's a convenience argument. And it's one of the key human instincts. And it's really hard to go to that person and say, I don't know, you are 57 years old, time to turn into a software engineer and give up everything in the community. Is just not going to happen. And so I wonder what would be, and I know that, solar punk and a lot of charter cities are kind of tending that way, are trying to incorporate this. Like we should have the community garden and we should have fresh milk and we should have happy children, whilst also have, high levels of safety, health, insane speed, transportation available. And I do think that unless, the technocratic future can produce some kind of promise or vision for something where people feel like, oh, I can smell this, it's green, there's greenery, I can smell this picture, this sounds good. You will always just have half of the people on board, right?
Yes, I think that's 100% right. I spent a month in Barcelona earlier this year, and
that sounds yummy.
It was incredible. I mean, I like still my favorite, I'm a workaholic, so my favorite part was that I had 5 hours in the morning before the East Coast woke up to just like actually sit there and write and not have to respond to any emails or anything. So that part was really nice. But like the lifestyle is great. And we met up actually with an old babysitter of mine from when I was like very young, and her husband, both of whom work 2 jobs. They're happy and like have a happy life and whatever. And she's like, I've been trying to come over to the US to see you forever. And we just like haven't been able to save enough money for a ticket. And like it I think puts the two for me at least, like that they live a good life in Europe and like they're happy and they go square dancing and they're square dance instructors is their second job and whatever. And they're very happy, but like they like just can't afford things in like the wider world and can't afford experiences that they want to be able to have. So to be able to make I don't know. I think super like I guess this ties also to the other point we were talking about since 1970 and the things that you can like actually feel and touch. Like it is very cool that SpaceX is doing what they're doing, and it is very cool that Anduril is doing what it's doing. I think Tesla is probably the first one that people could actually sit inside of these companies and be like, oh, this is actually really cool. But I do think we need more of those. Like, I just read about this company QB that's making homes out of little fact like people can get houses faster and more affordably if that one works out, or the supersonic plane, or looks at a company today that's doing super high speed internet in Colombia. Like these things like people can actually like get in their homes and experience, or like that actually tangibly makes their life better. Like my whole bet and thesis on techno optimism is that it's not just more Facebooks, but like that more of these things are going to start happening and making things that we use all of the time better, faster, cheaper. And just I can't wait to see what people do when we have a ton more energy with all of that extra energy. I talked to one founder who's like looking at the Port of Texas for an a power generation site, and they were like, we have like 50 50 factories that want to come and do different energy intensive things here that we are just energy constrained on. And so I think there's definitely more of an appreciation for energy now generally than there was 2 years ago. And I think there's still an underappreciation of what gets unlocked, like whether we all turn into like aluminum smelters because we have all of this like unbelievably cheap energy. I just think there's like a lot that will get unlocked that's hard to see, and some things that are a little bit easier to see that just need to be more tangible for people. But that is my bet on what's going to happen, and not, I think the VR stuff is interesting. I think the other thing people like the metaverse thing generally, I think like one of the things that people miss on that is that people have agency and they have a choice. Like if you don't want to spend your life in VR, like don't fucking spend your life in VR. I don't think all of the jobs are going to go into virtual reality, so you're like forced to spend all of your life there. Some people will like really want to put a headset on or glasses on and get like a beautiful movie theater experience. To your point though, like 4K versus your 27-inch TV, like there's hedonic adaptation there too. So I don't know. I think I want more variety and more things cheaper and more accessible for people, so that people have the choice to kind of do what they prefer.
Well, I'm kind of curious. What do you think of, because there are some miracles, coming online today. Like the GLP-1 inhibitors seem to be
Miracles.
unbelievable, and you're already seeing some pushback on them in terms of people kind of don't like the 1950s technology is good narrative, even when it's like provably like good. So I guess, do you think that there is going like that there will be a change, that people will have attitudes toward technology that are better, or do you?
I think they haven't always had those either. I mean, I think anybody who's on GLP-1 and losing weight likes it. And so I think like people for whom technology makes their life better, I think will like it. I think there's a lot of people who are like, shit, I go to the gym all the time and I eat healthy. And like you can just take a pill and lose weight. This is stupid. Or like there has to be another shoe that's going to drop here. This is bad, or whatever. Like this isn't how you're supposed to lose weight. But for the people like who have really like, I know plenty of people who are on GLP-1s who've struggled for a very long time and eaten healthy and tried to work out and make no progress, and then have this drug that actually makes this thing that everybody else seems to do very easily make that easy. Like they love it. And so I think the more there are things that actually improve particular people's lives, I think the better people feel. I also think like it is a myth that at any given time in history, people have just like loved technology. I'm guilty of this too. Like I look back at the world, like the first World's Fairs, and I was like, everybody loved technology then. And then you read accounts from the time. There's like also people who like really, really didn't like the new stuff that was happening then. Use like the TV and radio examples, and there's some people who didn't like TV and radio, but that's true for like practically any new technology that's come out at any point in history.
What's the name of the Twitter account? The Pessimist Archive.
Pessimist Archive, yeah.
It just like shows you all these horrified like news pieces, like the Telegram will make women infertile, bicycles lead to blindness. I don't know. It's like, no, that did not happen.
Yeah.
But do you think that there? I mean, do you think there has or has not been a meaningful change in the West's public perception of technology since like the 50s?
I think there was more optimism generally post World War II. I think a lot of that was maybe like even personally driven. You just gotten out of a war. More people than ever were able to buy their home and a car and like do all these things that felt personally gratifying. Whereas
Mhm.
like some of those things are more out of reach now, even as technology improves. Like the very obvious and famous chart of like TVs getting cheaper while everything else that people rely on gets more expensive, I think is a very real thing. And so hopefully technology can help fix some of those things. Some are just, healthcare. I mean, hopefully we just have pills. We find seven more GLP-1s for everything else, and you don't really need the healthcare system anymore. I am pretty optimistic on cancer. We've backed a couple of companies that are taking real shot. Like what I like about cancer at this moment right now is that like CAR T cell therapies are having a real impact at small scale. They're toxic, they're hard to scale, they're hard to manufacture, but like it does feel like there are some things that are actually really working at small scale, and it's becoming now kind of like an engineering problem in certain ways. And so we have two different approaches to kind of solving that problem in our portfolio that we're really optimistic about. Like the joke with Elliot, who's our biotech partner, is like we're the big risk to some of these companies now is that we're going to run out of things to invest in because like these guys are going to just like kind of cure all the diseases. It's not the case. It's not going to happen. But like there are really smart teams using really powerful technology to go after a bunch of these things that kind of seemed almost incurable for a very long time. And so like even healthcare, I think, potentially gets better. And GLP-1s alone will I'm sure reduce the burden on the healthcare system. Um, we spend what 3% of GDP on dialysis or some like crazy number, whatever that number is. Like I bet somebody will figure out a bio solution to that at some point as well. And so I do think like this is a slow chipping away of a lot of these things kind of over time. I think AI helps. I think AI drug discovery is probably a little bit overhyped right now. And there's a lot more like downstream things that need to get put in place. And the FDA is like trying pretty hard. I think it's certainly better than the NRC. But like there's, that approval process, I think is going to like smack a lot of companies in the face, and there's going to be like just like a bottleneck at the FDA if all of those the early stage AI drug development things actually work. So there's like always going to be things to figure out, but I do feel like a lot of kind of problems have interesting early solutions, at least many of which will fail, some of which will work, and will like slowly chip away at these things that I think hopefully make people feel like their life is getting better.
Also, why it's so important to read history, right? Like I love Bill Bryson's book At Home, and I always recommend it to people in the community. It's just the history of the home, and then he kind of like widens his lens and goes into how the city is constructed and sanitation and logistics. And it's good to be reminded that, in London, South London, there just used to be cholera forever. And that was just like normal stuff. And then one guy was like, well, what if the wells were clean? And then there was never any cholera again, ever again. And we just kind of forget that, right? You would think that, I don't know, Salk would be remembered. And then, during the pandemic, we had to like, and he has an like he cured polio. And we just kind of forgot that there used to be polio. And it's good to be reminded that these things are doable. At some point, there will be no cancer, and we won't remember how many people we lost, how scared we were for our own health, how many bad things we didn't do because we were scared. Like these things will be as passé as having to worry as a mother that your newborn has a 50% chance of dying. It's unthinkable today, and we will read these old 20th century novels, and watch movies, and we will no longer understand, like, how do these people even think, right? We won't even understand that mindset. And I think maybe this is actually a good moment to talk about anti-fragility now, not as a footnote, but as an actual open topic, because I find that, it's just such an important idea to think that a community, whether small or large, a country or a part of the world, can achieve anti-fragility, which is kind of this a Taleb-esque expression for becoming stronger under attack, right? Through entrepreneurship. So how do you think about that? What made you kind of coin this term?
I mean, I think one is I think probably like what brought us mind in the piece is just kind of that AGM idea that the less the government takes care of, the more up like and the more the breaks, the more opportunities there are for people. I think like an important part that we haven't touched on, but I think it's just like the underpinning of all of this is the Constitution and the rule of law. Like it's not the government like marching on its citizens or like walking to a factory with guns and shutting down the like assuming the absence of that kind of action, then like anything the government just kind of like messes up through rot is like an opportunity for someone to come in and fix things. Like I wrote about Primer, Brian Duck's company in our portfolio that's going out and trying to build kind of early school education that's much cheaper and more effective than public schools. And like they're having a bunch of success. They just got rules changed in terms of like what public spaces are able to be zoned for micro schools in Florida. And there's going to be these like kind of little wins over time, but they actually are delivering like pretty high quality educations for less money. And some states now are starting to say like, you know what, instead of us putting the money into opening new public schools, we're actually just going to like give you guys $10,000 a student. We'll do a pilot on X number of students and kind of go from there. And so like that's an example where if the public school system isn't working in certain places, like there's also a market solution on the other side, and more states, certainly red states more than blue states, are making ESAs a possibility so that families aren't paying out of pocket for these things. Like they're just kind of reallocating the dollars that they would have gotten from the government for that education. And I think there's a bunch of those examples in a lot of different cases. And so like, if you think that the free market solution, like I think government is like, I'm not full libertarian, like guardrails are valuable, but like the government's job is to like, is not to go out.
You think libertarians don't think that? They're not anarchists. Anyway, that's a different conversation.
True, but
I'm going to take this personally.
I think that there are very like it is just not the job of the government to go out and like fix these problems. And so if you think that market solutions are better than government solutions, then any time there's like the government providing something the market should provide and not doing as good a job as they should, and it's not illegal for a private company to come out and go out and fix it, then you might end up with a better solution.
You can just build things. I want people to have this kind of like tattooed somewhere. This is amazing. I want to, you start the piece with this famous or infamous kind of intro scene from Aaron Sorkin's The Newsroom, his famous failed TV show, and it failed because he just like stopped and walked out. So, it's easy to fail as a TV show that way. And this scene has been attacked from so many different angles, and it is a kind of preposterous piece of television, like The West Wing is. Like you watch The West Wing in 2024 and you're just like, your face melts off your head. Like, how could we, but it's different times. But, there's a reason why we keep going back to this scene. And the Jeff Daniels character, who is this stand-in for Sorkin and whose main characteristic as a character on this show, main character, is that he's a Republican working at a TV, which at the time was really unheard of. Another problem we solved, and we forget that we have a far more pluralistic media today. And this, of course, beautiful, thin, wide-eyed student girl who looks up to him, asks him, why is America the greatest country on earth? And then there is this kind of debate forming on the panel. And then, of course, the main character, the savior, Aaron Sorkin, comes in and gives this speech, basically kind of going back into itself and claiming that America is great because of this girl. Like it means nothing. But it really resonates with people when you watch it, right? Because I do think that America is the greatest country in the world. I don't fully understand why, like I keep thinking about it, but it is different from any other place that I've been to. And I think there's a reason why more people want to emigrate here than anywhere else in the world, even though they know that Denmark has free shit, but they still want to come here. And where people really seem to flourish and more people seem to achieve prosperity, even first-generation immigrants, than anywhere else. And so to me, there is something mysterious about the greatness of America. That's the reason why there are like 20 billion books written about this, right? If we knew why it's great, we wouldn't have to, like, Margaret Macmillan, the war historian, says that there are 15,000 books written on why the First World War broke out and 0 on why the Second World War broke out, because we know that. So I thought, like, let's solve this problem here in the remaining 10 minutes. So, so why do people think, what are the things that America gets so right? We know all the things that we fuck up, right? What is it that somehow this place gets right?
I've got a weird one for you that I got turned on to a couple of years ago, and it's always stuck with me, both because it kind of like has this, it's strange but kind of rings true. It's a Johns Hopkins psychologist that wrote this book called The Hypomanic Edge, which maybe you've heard before.
I think about that every time I can't sleep. I'm like, yep.
Yeah. Essentially, the argument is that if you look at the if you look at highly entrepreneurial societies, for instance, including ones that punch above their weight, like Australia, Israel, these kinds of things, you see a very high incidence of bipolarity. And now the bipolarity isn't the interesting part. What's interesting is that there are relatives of bipolars that are essentially just like sort of on this like spectrum, but they're sort of they're functioning, right? And so that's where he gets the idea of the hypomanic edge. And his argument is essentially that America, through all the unique circumstances of its founding, have essentially sourced like humanity's hypomanics through all of the people that have come. And that this is actually like seeded this strange, like this kind of like weird aspect of American culture where America has like the most extreme version of everything somehow, but yet it works. And so I would never argue that is like, that's the thing that makes America work, but it's an interesting thought. And it does and it feels interesting to think about, like, when you see how much more unhinged American culture seems to like the average American, there's like something kind of interesting there.
I love this. I love the book. And so for those who are not familiar, hypomania is basically a softer, more functioning version of bipolar disorder, where the individual has generally very high, like big highs. So a lot of energy, a lot of optimism, a little bit of grandiosity, but also very big lows. So, but the kind of, generally hypomaniacs are very achievement driven, because that's how you kind of keep up your high. And then failure feels very bad. And so you always try to like avoid that and just run ahead. And if you look at this culture, it's really like running ahead, right? If you showed a European person how many historic buildings get demolished in America, where people are just like, no, because we have to build a Macy's, like, so what? It was built in like 1850. Well, there were horses then. Who cares? Let's move on. And there's something. Would you agree with that, Packy? How do you see our founders? The founders in your portfolio want to come to America.
It's a very
How
good question.
crazy are they? We will edit out this part, okay?
No,
we'll make it like gated.
I hadn't thought about the crazy part. I think that tracks a little bit. I mean, there's like clearly the idea that like the people who were competitive and aggressive and smart and whatever enough to come here came here, which is the version of the argument that I've heard, and I think makes a lot of sense. I think it's like incredibly hard to talk about it without talking about like just the blessings in geography that America has, that like it's relatively safe geographically, that like every time we're running out of a resource, there's a new article where it's like, actually, we just found the world's like biggest lithium deposit, and like, oh shit, we actually need to figure out how to refine this stuff, but like pretty good. And so like that, I think, is like that combined with what you're talking about, combined with, I think, just like the general like if you believe that iteration speed gets you to like the right answer faster, as long as you're like at least like 1 degree in the right direction, and that a faster clock speed and iteration speed like gets you there faster. I think like America does have a faster iteration speed. I had to bring the caveat in because like people work really hard in Japan or Korea, or like there are places around the world where people work a lot of hours. China obviously has like the 996 culture, but I think like allowing for like kind of messiness plus speed, as long as you're like pointed in kind of the right direction, allowing for messiness and speed, like moves you higher faster. But we are just like naturally very, very blessed.
That's the kind of Tim Marshall argument, right? That this is the prime real estate. With friendly neighbors, insanely wide sea borders, and like a lot of guns as well, like try to invade from the coast. And on both sides, we have like two giant mountain ranges with some very angry people.
Yeah,
like,
it's pretty.
to happen.
It's pretty good. There's also like, I don't know, this the Vanderbilt book sticks in my mind, but there's like a point in his career, kind of like his transition from steamships only to trains, where he builds his own like huge kind of like luxury yacht that is like bigger than most of the battleships that any national governments in the world have, and then sails it to Europe to essentially just kind of like show off the fact that this random immigrant, like Dutch person from Staten Island is able to build this yacht that is like bigger than anything that any of those countries have, and that like people died, like people, multiple times there were boiler explosions or like people died falling off the railings in these things, and there were like all these battles between the different players, and like all this mess happened. But the result of that was that like while Europe was sitting over there thinking that they're better than the United States, this guy sails over a private citizen on a ship that he earned himself that was bigger than anything that they had. I thought it was like a beautiful encapsulation of the whole
What a
thing.
middle finger. What a middle finger to show your homeland. But now Europe seems to be maybe, waking up. I love it when an elderly politician tells a group of journalists that now we will start innovating because he decided. Do you have any hope, any hopes for my continent?
Yeah, I mean, like,
I mean, you're an optimist, so you have to, right?
no, Europe is Lindy. I think this tech, this like hopefully technology kind of lifts all boats. It's certainly good for us if we have allies that aren't going fully decrepit. And I think that like institutions do change over time. And like I think like Europe is probably a more extreme example of what people are on the right are afraid could happen to America if Kamala wins, and if like the left continues to win and we like get more and more stagnant in government. Like Europe is like that future now, but I don't think that is necessarily like a built-in has to be like that for everything. I do obviously think it would take change. It is a wonderful playground though. Like I really enjoyed visiting Barcelona and getting to eat cheap food. So if they don't get their act together, then that's a nice place to go vacation for Americans who want a little break. But no, I am kidding. Like I think the UK has done an impressive job. Like it seems like they're at least getting a little bit more tech forward on their own. There's at least European leaders who are out now saying that it shouldn't be. And I think that is like we talked about the morale and the leaders like actually just saying things that are in the right direction being kind of important. So I think that is a positive change. There's a lot of tape to cut, obviously, to fix it, but Europe's been around for a very long time.
There was this
Exactly.
thread on Twitter a couple of days ago by an Italian entrepreneur that it's impossible to start a startup for like administrative reasons in Italy because there's no tax category. I
Yeah.
mean, it's the same for me living in Belgium, and why I left after. I mean, I always wanted to leave, but it kind of like sped up the process because there's no like startup like you want to pay taxes the just amount after how you earn, and there's no like that's just not how they get paid. Like everybody works for a big company or is a small entrepreneur. Everybody has this like composite way of paying taxes, and then they get paid in a car or something. Like it just makes no sense. But you see Portugal and Spain, and I doubt that you can have hundreds of thousands of people going to Portugal and Spain running startups remotely from there, and that not have some kind of effect on the local population. I think we learn from each other.
Yeah.
There was this Bern Hobart piece, which I loved, that The Social Network was the most important movie ever made, because it made startups a thing. And we should just inspire some mimetic desire, right?
Yeah. I do think like at some point, maybe like I think it again, like the same thing that we've been talking about the past 50 years being like America making Facebook and America making Twitter and America making all these things, and people being like, oh, this is what they're working so hard for, like actually kind of makes sense. I think once we start making supersonic planes and really cheap energy and all, like people will want a little bit of that stuff in their own countries. So I don't know, who knows? A topic for a different salon, now that we're at the end, that I bet you have thoughts on is like, one, just like the idea of turnings or cycles generally, and like how there has to be a catastrophe, like the crisis mode at the end. If there's any way to avoid that, because I wonder if like Europe needs like just the crisis and then there's, you know, the awakening, or if like, and I view this the same way in America, like if you know that these things are happening, like do we need to go to war with China for like all of this to reset? Or is there some way where we can all just be like, all right, can we just like avoid the war and like get all like pretend that we went through that? So maybe that's a different salon. Let me get your
I
thoughts.
invest in aerospace as an angel investor, so I'm all here for that. And maybe for another conversation, I would love to bring together you and Rohit Krishnan. He has the whole thing on India, and we had a long conversation, which I absolutely love this idea that America and India are more similar than America and Europe. And there's, I think, a lot to discover there, especially when it comes to defense, aerospace, and generally like geopolitical polarities, right? Because India is going to be very, very important in this century for that
Yes.
reason. Packy McCormick, thank you for being here. This is always a joy to talk to you. Everybody here, I mean, amazing questions, comments. I absolutely loved it. If anybody wants to like write up something about this, your notes, I'm super happy to republish it on our blog. Spread the gospel, guys. You can just build things.
Amen.
Always the most basic and obvious things that people think, oh, I don't have to write it. I don't have to tell people because other people know it. And then in the end, nobody writes about it and nobody knows it. So go and write down what's obvious to you, because you would be surprised how few people that's actually obvious to. And Packy, thank you for your service and doing this as your life's job, because you tell people these very simple truths. And I think that you change lives through just representing that. So thank you so much for being you and doing what you do, and everybody who was here, to be continued.
Thank you for being you and making this happen. Thanks everybody for coming.
Here's to progress. Here's to the future. See you guys later.
Thank you all.
Good night.
Have a good night.